And I was just telling Michelle and her husband that I went and took my COVID shot with my mother because we're both in the same age group. I will be 70 soon, and she's 89. And so we had that appointment together each time. I have an introduction that takes a little while, and then I'll explain to you what I'll be talking about. And at the end, if you have questions, I'll be very glad to try to answer those. When I was growing up, we had a good family friend. Some of you remember Jerry Davenport. And she had come to Fairfield from West Virginia. And she always had a ready smile. Even when she was not happy about something, she seemed to have a half smile. And we had lots of laughs with her. She told us years ago that there was a song that aptly described a lot of the families in West Virginia. And I said, well, what would that be? And she said, the title of that song is, I'm my own grandpa. I'm my own grandpa. I looked that up. And it's been recorded by Willie Nelson and Ray Stevens and plenty of other people. It was written about 90 years ago and on the radio in the 30s and 40s. It goes like this. Now, many, many years ago, when I was 23, I was married to a widow who was pretty as could be. This widow had a grown-up daughter, had hair of red. My father fell in love with her, and soon the two were wed. This made my dad my son-in-law and changed my very life. My daughter was my mother because she was my father's wife. To complicate the matters, even though it brought me joy, I soon became the father of a baby boy. My little baby then became a brother-in-law to Dad, and so became my uncle, though it was sad. For if he was my uncle, that also made him the brother of the widow's grown-up daughter, who of course was my stepmother. I'm my own grandpa. It sounds funny, I know, but it really is so. I'm my own grandpa. We know as we age, the old saying, truth is stranger than fiction, is very, very true. Here is a true-to-life incident upon which that song was written. In other words, this really happened. The song was inspired by an anecdote published periodically by newspapers for over 150 years. The earliest time it was published was in 1822, and this is the true story. A proof that a man may be his own grandfather. There was a widow and her daughter-in-law, and a man and his son. The widow married the son, and the daughter the old man. The widow was therefore mother to her husband's father, consequently grandmother to her own husband. They had a son, to whom she was great-grandmother. Now, as the son of a great-grandmother must either be a grandfather or a great-uncle, this boy was therefore his own grandfather. This was actually the case of a boy in school in Norwich in the UK. Another real-life example, which brings all of this home to us, happened recently in Wayne County. I got in the car and I went with Brent Musgrave to Milshows to tune the church piano. He related to me different things, including the fact that Mayberry, which is south of Wayne City, was named for his ancestors and who lived there. And then that led to me talking about, well, where in the world did the name Mill Shoals ever come from? And I mentioned the famous Fort Shipley, which you all have read about in the paper. Judith Puckett wrote about that. And that was in the area west of Mill Shoals on the Skillet Fork River. And then that reminded Brent that his ancestor, William Coyle Musgrave, did business with both the Union and the Confederate armies at Fort Shipley and was lucky that he was never hanged. William Coyle Musgrave. I knew that name. Oh, he was an ancestor of my brother-in-law. Brent said his wife was, William Coyle's wife's name was Nancy Jane Murphy, my mom's maiden name, and that they were from Burnt Prairie, at which point a tone went off in my head. I knew that name also. Nancy Jane Murphy was the daughter of Davis Murphy and Lucinda Kahn, and Davis Murphy was the son of our ancestor, William Murphy, buried in Buckeye Cemetery east of Jeff. All that could mean one thing only. The descendants of William Coyle Musgrave and Nancy Jane Murphy Musgrave were descendants of our William Murphy of Jeff. Now that really hit home when I told my brother-in-law and sister that they were far-fetched cousins with the same ancestor, William Murphy. My guess is that if we did exhaustive searches into the genealogies of many people in Wayne County, and we would go back 200 years, we would find many similar incidents. Because the three big names are Simpson and Musgrave and Vaughn. And you know they had to have collided somewhere way back there in their early years. Oh, and by the way, all this story means my brother-in-law is my cousin. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight. As a lifelong Wayne County native, I'm interested in the county's history and in the many families who've made this area what it is today. My family is not really illustrious, so I can't saunter over to the bookcase and fetch a book to read about it. It doesn't exist. Likewise, the Wayne County history, which was written in 1884, has no sketches of my ancestors. So for my family to be remembered in posterity, somebody has got to dig into the past and preserve that history. Therefore, tonight, I would like to share with you a family history odyssey I've been on for about 53 years. We could call that journey family history or genealogy or family roots, whatever. As I take you through 6 points of interest, some of these points may also serve as helps to you in your attempt to save your history. We all need to work like towheads, folks, to save our history from a burn pile. And that's what I'm afraid will happen. I have worked all of these years, and my son and his wife could care less. I can just see them tossing all of my notebooks into a dumpster or creating a fire out back and burning it all up. It's a sobering thought. My main points are, step 1, you got to have interest in the past. 2, we're going to talk about services that genealogists had before 1970. 3, services that genealogists had after 1970. 4, organizing family tree information. 5, using organized information for some purpose. 6, cautions for the genealogist. And 7, two neat stories that are about family history. Step one, my interest in the past. When I was born in 1951, almost 70 years ago, I had 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and 1 great-great-grandfather, all of them living until I was about 6. I spent a lot of time with my dad's grandparents. They were Roy and Goldie Knapp, and they lived about a mile south of Jeff. We spent a lot of time outside, swinging in the swing, hoeing in the garden, peering around in the dark smokehouse, going into the cellar to fetch up things that were stored down there, feeding the chickens, picking fruit from the many, many trees, swinging around a rope in the barn, playing in the granary, and so forth. They also had a large box of pictures in the house. And we would get those out, and I would say, who is this? What are they doing? I developed a curiosity, and I learned a lot by talking to the both of them about their families, the Knapp family, the Harrell family. They were both born in 1888, and they became my connection with a time so very long ago. Eventually, I was pretty solid in my understanding of my dad's family genealogy. And by my teenage years, I began to develop my family tree. And my term paper for Sue Odom when I was a senior in high school was genealogy, which at that time was kind of in its infancy as far as catching hold and affecting so many people. Now the market is flooded with people who want to help us and make money from us to help us learn about our ancestors. That was not the case at the time. In my talk, anytime I say anything about a family historian or somebody working on the family tree or whatever, I'm just going to say genealogist. 2, before 1970, there were paltry few services that a genealogist could make use of. Family memories, family Bibles, clipped obituaries, courthouse records, library books, but very few of them, the RLDS church records, and then, of course, the professional genealogist. Xerox was a luxury then. You didn't go in and say, I'd like for you to copy this book for me. Each page was dear and cost a lot. And everything at that time that most genealogists used was basically saved on paper. It wasn't saved in any other way. 3, additional services came along after that. The computer made a huge difference. The internet made a huge difference. And suddenly, we had various for-profit companies that wanted to help us. Probably number 1 is Ancestry.com. Family Search, Family Tree DNA, Google, Find a Grave, Genie or Jenny, MyHeritage.com. And also, we were able to start scanning and sending and printing pictures, which had never been possible before. 4, what do you do with the information that you have? Do any of you have like a box or a drawer or a notebook that has a bunch of stuff about your family in it? Yes? Do you sometimes want to think to yourself, I'd really like to do something with that, but I don't know what to do? Yeah. That's what I mean when I say organizing family tree information, making sense out of that mess. Our families' stories are similar to a big jumbled box of stuff or things. We've got in our heads important stories, details, pictures without names on them, and so forth. We have all kinds of stuff that we are saving but we're not making it possible to hand them on to somebody else and make any sense out of them. We might have a junk drawer, a junk room. Some people have a junk house. It's just like, but whatever you have, you know that it can be overwhelming because you don't know what to do with it. You really don't. All of the things that you saved are pleasant to you because you were part of that. But when the mess is chaotic, when stuff is stored in your mind or on little slips of paper or clippings, it's a sobering thought to think that all that's going to be lost when we draw our last breath. Recently, for example, my cousin found new information about my mother's great-grandmother, Great-Grandma Brock. She used to walk from Albion to Sisney, and she was beyond 90 at the time. And they would look up and they say, "There's Grandma Brock, she's here." She had no car, she didn't want one. She walked all that way, and it was so far that she had a friend halfway that she would stay overnight with and then finish up the next day. She was descended from Indians, we found. And Mother said, that story you said about her being an Indian reminded me that when she first married, she had 2 children, and her family was on horseback going to Albion. And her husband said, "I've got to go back home and get something. I'll meet you in town." After that moment, they never saw him again. He was planning an escape. He ran off with a woman to Kansas, and he never ever helped them or acknowledged them in any way the rest of their lives. And Grandma Brock had to make her own way. This was 1870 something. And of course, there she was with 2 children and a farm. And that was all she had, and a big debt on that too. I said, "Well, did they find out when he died? Did they find out why he abandoned his family?" And my mom said, "I sure wish my mom had written all of this down, but there's no one to ask now." I don't remember any of it. That's what we want to prevent. As genealogists, then, we've got to take what we know, which may be visible in a box or wherever in our brains, and help it to make sense. One thing that will help us is the right tools. And these are very concrete tools. The first thing that I swear by is a 3-ring binder. If you have your stuff in a box, in a sack, if you have it in the garage, underneath some oil cans and so forth, it's not going to be as useful to you as if you put it in a binder like this. That binder needs tabs and dividers in it so your stuff doesn't get all mixed together. And the farther you go back, the more names you have, the more families you have. And it gets very, very complicated. You need dividers in there. Another thing you need, you've got to have a hole punch. And I've had this one for many, many years. It was worth the money because I use it every day to punch and to save something in my binders. I have 21 of these binders, about this thick, full of stuff. But it's not so overwhelming because I know what's in here. It's the Bunting family, the Bailey family, and the Stennett family. I may take a while to find it, but I think it's probably in there if I'm looking for it. You also need a pedigree chart. This is the one that you can find on Ancestry.com. They allow you to print it and identify themselves at the top. And you simply start with, if you're just starting your chart, yourself, and then your parents, and then your grandparents, and then your great-grandparents. And when you get to the end of that, you have all of these great-grandparents, 8 of them, and then you can go back and you can start with the 8th one and start that person's pedigree chart and continue on. So you can have a big supply of these and just keep going. I had tons of these in my notebook right here, for example. And it just goes, and eventually you'll have places that aren't filled in because you can't find what you're looking for. The object is to punch holes and to place every page in a 3-ring binder that acts like a book. And when you put stuff in there, you can look at it and it's not going all over the place. And also, you're not making another pile. You're simply turning the pages. Also, these piles of paper that you accumulated are not allowed. You just can't have them. They take over. I also do not save stuff in my computer for fear that I will lose it. And some of you are much better about that than I am, but I still trust paper more than anything else. Another tool, before we move on, is a network of people who are knowledgeable. That might be relatives, or it might be someone who's not a relative. I have had more non-relatives to help me out than I have had help from blood relatives. Some people, even though they're not related to you, genuinely enjoy helping you in your quest to discover people in your far family, back in years, many years ago, in those families. 5. Okay, once you get your information, then what's to do with it? You just leave it there and hope someone picks it up some year and saves it? Yes. But sometimes you can have a whole bookcase of binders, as I do, and they can serve as a reference library for the future, for yourself or for anybody else in your family who's interested. And if you have it clearly labeled, then those people aren't overwhelmed because they don't know what to do with the information. A second thing you can do with the information is use it for writing projects. For history, for example, I decided that I would write in 2011 a book about my mom's mother. And at that time, I had limited resources, and so I used the Xerox at school and ran it all off. I even included pictures when I could. It's not a beautiful thing, but I remember my mom's sister, who passed away soon after this was done, said that she really appreciated it because someone needed to save all of those things about her mom, and no one had ever done it. I did the same kind of thing with my mom's grandparents, whose names were Roy and Rhoda Murphy. I got a little more upscale with this book, and Don Witter helped me assemble it, and has a nice cover. It has a lot of good pictures in it, and I enjoyed every minute of working with that. In both cases, I drew on what I had already assembled in these notebooks. Another thing you can do with it is historical fiction. I never thought of that as being valuable because I thought, if you've got facts about your family, why would you want to add fiction to it? Well, I don't know that I would call it fiction as much as writing or illustrations or elaborations that are likely, because you may know something about the person's personality, and so you may feel free to write certain things because they fit that personality, even though you don't have documentation. When I wrote Covered Wagon Odyssey, which Donna held up earlier, that's what I did. This book is based on a diary that my great-great-grandmother, whose name is Mary Knapp, which she wrote when her family made a 500-mile trip from Abilene, Kansas to the area of Brush Creek. And she wrote each day a short entry into this diary. And I always thought, wouldn't it be neat if we knew more? So I created more. I based it on what I knew about them. I interviewed family members to get some idea of what their personalities were like. And it was a very, very worthwhile thing for me to do. That was written in 2010. In 2017, I used the next form of writing from the notebooks, and that's biography. And so I wrote about our minister for 34 years, Carol Kakak. And of course, that was a different writing experience because I had to rely more on interviews than on anything else, interviews with him. I also have written several things that I call tributes. When I was in high school, I just thought so much, but also feared Mrs. Nodell. And who wouldn't? She was an institution, very much so. And so in the pink press, I wrote 5,000 words about her. And I found the neatest picture of her, which showed her at age 20. She looked like a Grecian goddess or someone from Pompeii. I mean, you just couldn't believe what she looked like. So what did they put in the paper? This one, and left out the good one. At any rate, I felt like a lot of people felt the same way I did, that she gave and gave and gave. She taught until she was 76 years old. And even then, who would cross her? You know, she was scared of the principal. You know, I mean, everybody was scared of her. She was not scared. He was scared of her. And that was a fact. So tributes can be written. I've written many newspaper columns based on these notebooks. And one of them was about my grandma Knapp and her expression, "Oh, I'm too old to cut the mustard anymore." And I used this old photograph, which includes her father-in-law, to illustrate that. One time I wrote about my grandma's house and having Christmas in the garage. And I put a picture of her in there. And so I've written many of those, and there are more to come. And then the final thing that I've done with all this information is to create a book of genealogy. I have a lot of cousins on my dad's side and cousins on my mom's side. And so I got all of this done and then had my brother-in-law he probably wouldn't do it now that I've told you he and his wife are cousins. I asked him to please print it, and it included a lot of pictures in the back too. And by the way, when you start making these charts, you need to give each person a number. That is a huge help, because if your dad is number 2 and your mom is number 3, anything you find about them, you put a 2 or a 3 on it. And then you just keep going so that the person is more than a name. He has an identifying number that will make it easier to keep the facts straight. 6, let the genealogist beware. Here are some cautions to keep in mind. All information that you find is subject to distortion and therefore untruth. And why would we end up with information that's not true? Well, sometimes stories take a huge change as they're told and told and told over time. And so the story as it started is not the same as the story 100 years later. Another thing that happens is genealogists sometimes assume that data is correct when it's not. I found this many times, and I don't know how it's happened, but I'm sure that they have not reported a fact that wasn't correct in a way that they meant to. It's just that they believed it. Sometimes there's also personal bias, which you have to be aware of. Recently, I discovered an ancestor's first marriage and several children. That first marriage was completely omitted from his page on Ancestry. People being what they are may have perpetuated a jealousy that the second wife and children had toward the first set. And so the second set just disregarded the first set, the wife and the children, just as if they never existed. And who's to set them right and say you can't do that? Personal bias thing can happen. And then finally, you need to be patient. That's a byword that you have to get used to. I have had mysteries that have finally been partially concluded after 40 or 50 years of looking and waiting. I've had pictures I had no idea who they were until something would click and I would know. And what if I'd thrown that away? You should have patience that maybe along the line someday you'll know the facts, you'll know the person in the picture, you'll know why, you'll know when, and so forth. It's not instant like our culture is. When you go to Ancestry and click for information, that gives you the sense that it's just fast. No, it's not. Someone's probably worked many years to get that page to where it is, and it will change more as time goes on. I have two stories I would like to share with you in conclusion. They're both true. The first one is about Woodson Bryant. Woodson Bryant was a jovial man. He was always cutting up, so to speak, but this cost him his life. One day, when there was a group of men helping a neighbor butcher, Woodson was joking and laughing with a smaller man. I believe that the writer says, I believe they were rendering the lard and were standing around the kettle to warm themselves by the fire. Woodson laughingly picked up a smaller man and tossed him high above his head. As he let him down, the smaller man slid down close to Woodson's body, and the smaller man's butchering knife, which he had put into his belt, penetrated Woodson's chest, striking his heart and killing him instantly. What an exciting time that must have been. Wow. The second one comes from a cousin of mine. She and I wrote a lot to each other because she was also a descendant of John Jackson Harrell, who was my grandma Knapp's grandfather. And she wrote me this note about him. From what I can deduce, John Jackson must have been somewhat extraordinary. My grandfather George told me that John Jackson killed a man with a knife back in Tennessee or Kentucky. He had to leave the country. John Jackson's father, John, who owned a fairly good-sized plantation with several slaves. This man was very large, over 6'4". He rode a black Tennessee Walker horse in order to supervise the work on the plantation. He had several boys, of which, of course, John Jackson was one. John Jackson was very adventuresome. One night he was at a party, which may have been an old-time square dance type of affair, maybe at a school or a community meeting. The local boys of the neighborhood were jealous of John Jackson, who seemed to have more material wealth than they. A fist fight evolved, but it got rougher as it proceeded. John Jackson was soon fighting for his life. He drew his knife. He killed the boy. He fled to his home. His father put him on a horse, not the good Tennessee Walker, and John Jackson faded away into the night, headed for a new country. He ended up in southern Illinois and eventually the Xenia area. Now that's a neat story. Very, very little of it is the truth. And she thought it was. Her grandfather told her. And her grandfather was this man's son. You know. I found out in recent years, John Jackson Harrell's father was not John Harrell. His name was Zachariah Harrell. He didn't own a plantation. He didn't have slaves. He was a poor sharecropper in eastern Tennessee with 8 children depending on him. He was accused and found guilty of stealing an axe. He was sentenced to a year in the Knoxville prison. He died there of an infectious disease after 6 months. He was buried with other inmates who were paupers, or what we used to call a pauper's burial. So much for the plantation story, the horse, the slaves, and so forth. And so every once in a while, what you think you know, you'll find out you don't know. And you have to adjust because it's hard sometimes to give up the stories that we cling to. We are now at the end of the road on our family history odyssey. You're welcome to look at any of this stuff that I've left up here if you choose to do that. It has been a privilege and an honor to speak before you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions, but I have to probably come close to you to hear what you say. That's what comes with age. Anyone have anything they'd like to ask?
Steve, I got a question. You used the term too old to cut the mustard.